We like to think of democracy as ancient, timeless, almost sacred, as if it was born alongside civilization itself, as if the moment people gathered in villages, someone raised their hand and said, "Let's vote." But that's not how it happened, not even close. We point to Athens, 5th century BCE, the so-called birthplace of democracy, a shining marble city where citizens gathered to decide their future. Except here's the truth. That democracy, it was exclusive, deeply flawed. Women couldn't vote, slaves couldn't vote, foreigners couldn't vote. In fact, the vast majority of people who lived under Athenian democracy had no voice at all. It wasn't democracy for all. It was democracy for the few, the male, the elite, the freeborn. And even that version didn't last. In less than 2 centuries, Athenian democracy collapsed under its own weight. War, infighting, populist leaders who promised too much and delivered too little. Rome watched that collapse and took a different path. They gave their people a republic, in name. But real power? It stayed with the Senate, with emperors, with the military. Democracy was a brand, not a system. And after that, darkness. For nearly 2,000 years, democracy disappeared from the global stage. It didn't spread, it didn't evolve, it vanished. The Middle Ages didn't debate representation. They debated divine right. Kings ruled by God's will. Questioning authority wasn't just illegal, it was heresy. So if democracy is truly ancient, why did the world spend most of its history avoiding it? That's the real story we need to understand. Because democracy wasn't humanity's default setting. It was a radical interruption, a fragile experiment that nearly didn't survive. And what comes next depends on whether we remember how rare it really is. For most of human history, politics wasn't about people, it was about power. Not distributed, not debated, not earned, but seized. Tribes became chiefdoms, chiefdoms became kingdoms, kingdoms became empires, and at every stage, rule came from above, from bloodlines, from conquest, from divine authority. Pharaohs claimed the sun spoke to them. Chinese emperors ruled by the mandate of heaven. European kings held crowns they said were blessed by God himself. To challenge a ruler wasn't just rebellion, it was blasphemy. There were no ballots, only battles. You weren't a citizen, you were a subject. Even the few systems that gave people a voice, like some tribal councils or Icelandic assemblies, were exceptions, not the rule. Tiny blips on the historical timeline. Why? Because letting people decide was risky, messy, unpredictable. Power, when centralized, is efficient. It keeps order. It preserves wealth. But democracy? It requires trust, in strangers, in disagreement, in process. And for most of history, those ideas were unthinkable. You did what you were told. You knew your place. And if you didn't, there were prisons, or swords, or gallows. So no, democracy wasn't the foundation civilization was built on. It was the revolution waiting to happen. And eventually, it did. But not because elites wanted it, because people demanded it. And they didn't ask politely, they rose up. To understand how rare democracy is, you have to understand how deeply it's been feared. Not just by kings and tyrants, but by philosophers, by lawmakers, by intellectuals. Even in ancient times, thinkers like Plato warned that giving power to the masses would lead to chaos. Why? Because the people were seen as emotional, easily manipulated, dangerous. Plato argued that only the wise, philosopher kings should rule. And centuries later, the same fear echoed through the halls of European courts and colonial assemblies. Even in the American founding, democracy was not the default. The founding fathers built a republic, with checks, with balances, with many layers between the people and power. They feared mob rule as much as monarchy. That's why the US Senate wasn't elected directly until 1913. That's why the Electoral College exists. That's why voting rights were so limited. Because for most of history, giving everyone a voice was seen as a threat, and in many ways, it still is. Democracy is disruptive. It shifts power. It questions tradition. It asks uncomfortable questions about who should decide and why. So when you hear that democracy has stood the test of time, remember, it's actually spent most of that time being suppressed. The miracle isn't that democracy is old, it's that it survived at all. Here's one of the biggest myths we still believe. That democracy is something handed down, like a gift. As if one day, a nation wakes up and someone says, "Congrats, you're a democracy now." But that's not how it works. Democracy isn't received. It's built, brick by brick, fight by fight, often through blood. Look at history. The Magna Carta wasn't a democratic moment. It was a desperate negotiation between a weak king and rebellious barons. The American Revolution wasn't fought to give everyone a vote, but to replace British rule with local control. The French Revolution overthrew a monarchy, only to descend into dictatorship. Progress came in fits and starts. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and always with resistance. Because democracy isn't just about elections. It's about culture, institutions, values, laws that protect the minority, norms that restrain the powerful. And those don't appear overnight. They're shaped by conflict, by protest, by trial and error. Every generation redefines what democracy means. Who gets to participate? What voices count? What freedoms matter? And that work? It never ends. Because democracy isn't a destination. It's a direction. One we have to choose. Again and again. The 20th century should have been democracy's golden age. 2 world wars had shaken the globe. And in the rubble, nations stood up and said, "Never again." Never again would one man, one party, or one empire decide the fate of millions unchecked. Never again would the people be silenced, erased, or used as pawns. And so, democracy surged. From Europe to Asia, South America to Africa, country after country began to embrace elections, constitutions, parliaments. It was messy, often chaotic, but it was movement. The United Nations was born. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights followed. And for a brief moment, it looked like democracy might actually go global. By the end of the Cold War, over 100 countries held regular elections. Democracy was winning not just the wars, but the narrative. Even dictators started holding elections, at least on paper. Even authoritarian regimes called themselves democratic republics. Because democracy had become a currency of legitimacy. But just as it spread, it found new enemies. And they weren't always who you'd expect. They weren't kings or colonizers. They were insiders. Leaders who rose through democratic systems, then slowly dismantled them from within. They didn't storm palaces. They rewrote laws. They captured courts. They stacked the press. And they did it with the people's permission. Or at least, their exhaustion. Because by the 1990s and early 2000s, democracy began to feel ordinary, predictable, slow, frustrating. Corruption scandals, partisan gridlock, broken promises. The shine began to fade, and into that vacuum walked strongmen with simple answers. They promised to drain the swamp, to restore order, to speak for the real people. And in country after country, they won. sometimes at the ballot box, sometimes behind closed doors. But the result was the same: less transparency, less accountability, more control, and always, they said it was what the people wanted. This is democracy's 21st century paradox. It's never been more widespread, and yet never more at risk. It's wearing the right clothes, but often speaking the wrong language. So the next question isn't just, will democracy survive? It's, in what form? Because democracy's enemies don't always march with flags. Sometimes they wave them. Here's the irony no one saw coming. For all its ancient myths, its marble statues, its dusty scrolls, the real age of democracy might still be ahead of us. Because while the past was ruled by kings, and the present feels uncertain, the future, it's still unwritten. Young people across the world are demanding more voice, not less. They're connected, organized, restless. They're not waiting for permission. They're building new platforms, starting new movements, redefining what democracy can mean in a digital age. It won't look like the systems we know. It might not even use the same words, but it will carry the same fire. That power should serve people, not rule them. And for all the fear, all the regression, all the threats, there is one truth we can't forget. Democracy doesn't live in marble halls or old constitutions. It lives in the decisions we make. To show up, to speak out, to imagine better. So maybe the question isn't whether democracy is ancient. Maybe it's whether we're finally ready to make it real. Not for some, but for all. If this video gave you a new lens on democracy, if it made you question the myths, the systems, and what still needs building, then hit that subscribe button. Subscribe and share it with someone who thinks democracy is already finished evolving. Because it isn't. This is where history meets the present and quietly reveals the future.